Imagine finding out that your local city mayor, the person you actually elected to fix the potholes on your street.
Right. The person keeping the buses running.
Exactly. The buses, the zoning for that new grocery store, all of those normal municipal things.
Yeah.
Imagine finding out that this person is secretly trying to negotiate a foreign policy agreement with the government of Iran.
It sounds totally absurd.
It sounds like a bad political thriller, honestly.
Well, definitely.
But according to the highly charged political commentary we are diving into today, that is exactly the kind of just boundary-breaking reality we're living in right now.
It really is. It's a perfect example of what we're exploring today, which is basically the complete collapse of traditional boundaries.
Yeah.
We're looking at this environment where every single issue, no matter how hyper-local or, seemingly mundane it is, it gets immediately elevated into this global existential battle.
And that is exactly why we are doing this. If you are someone who actively wants to learn and understand the world, right? If you're that classic learner who checks your phone in the morning and immediately just feels the sheer velocity of the news cycle hitting you.
Like 100 miles an hour.
Right, exactly. So consider this deep dive your curated shortcut. We are unpacking a really dense stack of political commentary today, specifically derived from a July 13th, 2026 broadcast of the Rubin Report.
A very dense stack.
Yeah, and our mission here is to extract the underlying themes connecting local New York City politics, the physical fragility of aging political titans in Washington, and of course, these volatile, escalating geopolitical shifts in the Middle East.
But before we get into the actual mechanics of this, we really need to set some clear ground rules for you, the listener.
Always important.
Very important. The material we're analyzing today, it is not neutral, it is fiercely partisan, and it contains some highly specific, deeply charged political viewpoints.
Exactly. And our mission here is absolutely not to endorse or condemn the views presented in this commentary.
Right. We are not taking sides.
Not at all. Think of us as your impartial guides through a very complex architectural structure. We're here to neutrally analyze the arguments, deconstruct the narratives being built by this broadcast, and, just help you understand how these specific political arguments are engineered to persuade an audience.
We are putting on our media literacy hats today.
We really are.
We're looking at the rhetoric, the historical mechanisms behind the claims, and just the underlying logic of the arguments being presented to the audience.
Okay, let's unpack this, and we're starting right at the local level, which, as we just hinted at, isn't really staying very local anymore.
No, not at all.
We are starting in New York City, looking at the administration of Mayor Zohran Mamdani.
Right.
The broadcast we're analyzing, it highlights this truly bizarre controversy where local city government suddenly collided head-on with international foreign policy.
Yeah, the commentary zeroes in on this planned meeting that was ultimately squelched by the U.S. State Department.
Thank goodness.
Right. So Anna Maria Archila, who is a senior official acting as the Commissioner for International Affairs for Mayor Mamdani, she was reportedly set to meet with Iran's UN ambassador.
Amir Saeed Iravani.
Exactly.
Which is just wild when you actually stop and think about the mechanics of it. The United States and Iran are essentially in a state of asymmetric conflict.
Yes.
They do not have normal diplomatic relations.
Yeah.
So for a local municipal official to try and bypass the federal government to meet with a hostile foreign power, how does that even work legally?
Well, historically, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And it's highly controversial.
I would imagine.
Yeah, in the U.S., the federal government has exclusive authority over foreign policy. This is rooted in the Constitution to prevent exactly this kind of chaos, right? You can't have 50 different states, let alone thousands of individual cities negotiating their own foreign treaties.
It would be total anarchy.
Total anarchy. And when local officials step into this arena, it touches on the spirit of things like the Logan Act.
Right, the Logan Act.
Which is this very old federal law criminalizing unauthorized American citizens from negotiating with foreign governments that have a dispute with the United States.
Wow.
Now, it's rarely prosecuted, but the principle absolutely remains. City mayors do not dictate federal diplomacy.
And that totally explains why the State Department had to physically step in and cancel this meeting. They actually had to issue a clarification on acceptable conduct for city officials.
They had to put it in writing.
Yeah. Now, Mayor Mamdani's defense was just complete ignorance. He claimed he had absolutely no idea this meeting was being coordinated until the press ambushed him with questions.
Right.
He stated the meeting didn't happen, it wasn't going to happen, and he was completely out of the loop.
But the commentator in our source material fiercely rejects that denial.
They don't buy it at all.
Not for a second. The broadcast uses this incident to paint a picture of a local administration that is actively running a shadow foreign policy operation right out of Gracie Mansion.
Yeah, the narrative being built here is that this mayor is more focused on global ideological conflicts, specifically highlighting hostility toward Israel and sympathy for adversarial regimes like Iran, rather than, focusing on fixing local municipal decay.
What's fascinating here is how the broadcast takes this high-level, shadowy diplomatic controversy and instantly fuses it to something incredibly visual and hyper-local.
The map?
The map. Right after talking about the squelched Iran meeting, the commentary pivots to this massive, fiery controversy over a new immigrant enclave map released by the city of New York.
Is such a deliberate narrative transition.
Yeah.
The broadcast uses these two seemingly disparate events, a canceled diplomatic meeting and a local tourism map, to construct a single unified theory of ideological erasure.
Right.
So the city released this map, and it's designed to highlight various cultural neighborhoods to promote tourism and cultural heritage.
Sounds nice on paper.
It does. It featured places like Little Senegal, Little Palestine, Little Yemen, Little Ecuador, Little Dominican Republic, and Little Egypt.
Which, if you just read that list, it sounds like a standard celebration of New York's famous diversity.
Right. But the broadcast points out some glaring, absolutely massive historical omissions, namely the complete erasure of historical European and Jewish immigrant hubs.
Yeah.
There was no Little Italy on the map. No Jewish enclaves on the Lower East Side or the Upper West Side. No Greek enclave in Astoria, Queens.
And the local backlash to this was visceral. I mean, the broadcast featured specific reactions from the community, most notably from the Bari family.
Oh, yeah.
And to understand the weight of this, you really have to understand the history here.
Sure.
The Bari family, they are the founders of the famous St. Gennaro Festival in Little Italy.
Which is huge.
It's massive. It's a cultural touchstone that has been operating for 120 years. Their ancestors arrived during that huge wave of Italian immigration between 1880 and 1920. They settled in the Five Points neighborhood.
Right. They literally built the foundations of that area.
Exactly. They built a foundational pillar of New York's civic identity. And suddenly, on an official government document in 2026, their geographic footprint just doesn't exist.
It's just wiped out. And the broadcast frames this not as a simple bureaucratic oversight by, an overworked graphic designer, but as a deliberate ideological weaponization of cartography.
That is a strong phrase.
It is. The commentator argues that the Mamdani administration is intentionally erasing the historical communities who built the city. The Irish, the Italians, the Jews, the Greeks, in order to favor newer politically aligned groups.
And the rhetoric gets incredibly sharp here.
It really does. The broadcast actually states that this is the historical pattern. First, erasing the Jewish presence, which the commentator explicitly calls the canary in the coal mine, and then systematically moving on to erase other historical groups like the Italians.
We really need to pause and look at the psychological mechanics of maps here.
Let's do it.
Maps are inherently political documents. When a city issues an official map, they are essentially defining reality.
Right, they're saying what is and isn't there.
Yes. It validates a community's historical footprint. It officially says, you belong here, you are woven into our civic identity.
So to be omitted from that map, especially after a century of undeniable cultural contribution, that's a form of bureaucratic invalidation.
Exactly. The broadcast is tapping into a very deep emotional vein of cultural anxiety for its audience.
I hear that, but I have to push back a little on the grand conspiracy being laid out here. Let's look at the two things we just connected.
Okay.
On one hand, you have a local mayor whose office is allegedly trying to play UN ambassador with Iran. That is akin to your neighborhood homeowners association president trying to independently negotiate a free trade agreement with China.
That's a great analogy. It's absurdly out of scope.
It requires a massive level of hubris. But then on the other hand, you have this map issue. Is it really a grand, orchestrated ideological conspiracy to erase Little Italy? Or is it just staggering bureaucratic incompetence?
Right, Hanlon's razor.
Yes. We've all seen city governance mess up basic paperwork. Why attribute malicious geopolitical strategy to what is essentially a terrible graphic design approval process?
It's the classic application of Hanlon's razor. Never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity or incompetence.
Exactly.
And in any massive municipal bureaucracy like New York City, incompetence is statistically very, very likely.
Highly likely.
However, for the audience of this broadcast, the incompetence theory is wholly unsatisfying, and the commentator actively rejects it.
Why? Just because it doesn't fit the larger narrative.
Exactly. The commentator is building a cohesive worldview for the listener. They argue that when your senior municipal officials are attempting rogue diplomacy with hostile foreign regimes like Iran, the erasure of Jewish and Italian neighborhoods on a local map, well, it isn't a typo.
Right.
It is a manifestation of that exact same hostile anti-Western worldview, just applied at the local zoning level.
Wow. It's a complete erosion of the boundary between local civic administration and global ideological warfare.
Perfectly said.
When a local mayor adopts a global foreign policy, it reflects a total collapse of traditional political boundaries.
Oh.
And we are seeing that exact same boundary collapse at the federal level in the very next section of this broadcast.
Where the State Department is no longer just looking at foreign threats, but turning its apparatus inward.
Yes.
Yeah.
We pivot from a mayor allegedly trying to run a shadow foreign policy to the actual federal foreign policy apparatus in Washington bringing the hammer down.
The broadcast shifts its focus over to Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and they elevate him as this clear, concise moral voice in this chaotic landscape.
The commentator specifically highlights Rubio's stark, uncompromising assessment of Iran. Rubio doesn't just frame Iran as a geopolitical rival competing for resources. He labels them an apocalyptic regime.
And Rubio's historical examples, as highlighted by the broadcast, are meticulously chosen to prove this exact point.
Yeah, he brings up the 1994 bombing of the AMA Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, Argentina, which was carried out by Hezbollah proxies funded by Iran. He mentions the engineering and distribution of explosively formed penetrators, those roadside bombs that killed and maimed so many American servicemen in Iraq.
Devastating weapons.
Truly. And he details the global network of assassinations targeting political dissidents. He's building a chronological, geographic case that Iran is the world's premier sponsor of terror.
Let's break down the mechanics of the term asymmetric conflict here, because it's vital to understanding Rubio's point.
Good idea.
Traditional conflict is symmetric, two standing armies wearing uniforms fighting over a border.
Right, standard warfare.
Exactly. Asymmetric conflict is when a weaker power avoids direct military confrontation with a stronger power, like the U.S., and instead uses unconventional tactics.
Because they know they can't win a head-on fight.
Exactly. So they use proxy militias like Hezbollah or the Quds Force to carry out bombings, cyber attacks, or assassinations globally.
Yeah.
Notice the narrative function of the specific examples the broadcast chose to highlight here. By citing Argentina, Iraq, and global assassinations, the argument establishes that Iran's threat is not contained to the Middle East. It is a completely borderless, asymmetric threat.
And that framing perfectly sets up the very next piece of information the broadcast presents, which is a massive domestic shift.
Yes, State Department spokesman Tommy Pujo.
Right. He announces a coordinated international effort to target and disband Antifa.
This is a critical moment in the rhetorical structure of the commentary. The State Department is officially designating Antifa based on violent activities.
Yeah, they are citing organized kidnapping, the coordinated targeting of U.S. law enforcement, and the targeting of civilian populations.
And Pujo specifically notes that international partners were proactively reaching out to the U.S. to join this effort. They were arguing that Antifa has become a borderless global problem.
They're showing up at protests worldwide, heavily masked, engaging in coordinated property destruction, much like the sustained attacks we saw on federal courthouses in Portland, Oregon a few years back.
Now, if we connect this to the bigger picture, placing the segment on Iran's global terror network immediately adjacent to the segment on Antifa's global protest network, it does something very specific.
It's very intentional.
The commentator is explicitly lumping domestic far-left agitators and foreign hostile regimes into a singular adversarial bucket.
Well, hold on. I have to ask, doesn't that fundamentally distort the scale of these two things?
How do you mean?
Well, you have Iran, a sovereign nation state with a nuclear program, ballistic missiles, and state-funded proxy armies.
Right.
And then you have Antifa, which is largely described by experts as a decentralized, loosely organized ideological movement of domestic protesters and rioters.
Yeah.
Isn't lumping them together just intellectually dishonest?
From a purely structural standpoint, yes. They operate on completely different scales of capability and organization.
Obviously.
But Rhetorically, for the commentator, the scale isn't the point. The ideology is the point. The broadcast is framing the federal government's strategy as fighting a two-front war against ideological extremism aimed at dismantling the American system.
Wow.
One front is abroad, one front is at home, but in this narrative, they are driven by the exact same destructive impulse.
And the broadcast points out just how incredibly volatile the foreign front is right now. They detail a massive escalation in the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, U.S. Central Command.
Exactly. Central Command had to launch a third round of military strikes against Iran after Iranian forces attacked a Cyprus-flagged container ship in international waters.
But the timeline of those events is what the commentator uses to make their ultimate point about diplomacy.
Oh, the timeline is absolute whiplash. The broadcast plays an audio clip of President Trump stating that he had literally just reached a comprehensive deal with Iran.
Just finish the deal.
Yeah, he's on tape saying they were giving up everything, the negotiations were successful, and then, exactly 2 hours later, an Iranian drone hits a commercial ship.
The commentator uses this staggering sequence of events to introduce a philosophical argument against diplomatic norms.
Right.
They reference Trump's famous art of the deal methodology, the bravado, the financial leverage, the high-stakes pressure tactics.
The classic Trump approach.
Right. This is a methodology built on the assumption that all parties ultimately act in their own rational economic self-interest.
But the broadcast asks, how do standard negotiation tactics work when applied to what Rubio termed an apocalyptic regime?
They don't.
It's like shaking hands on a real estate deal. You sign the papers, and before you can even back your car out of the parking lot, the seller is out there setting the house on fire.
That's the perfect analogy.
It completely defies the logic of self-interest.
Because if the actor across the table is not primarily motivated by economic self-preservation, but by radical ideological dominance or a theological mandate, well, traditional leverage fails entirely.
You can't threaten to bankrupt someone who believes poverty is a virtue in a holy war.
Exactly. The broadcast suggests that the administration is realizing in real time that transactional diplomacy is totally useless here, which necessitates immediate military deterrence, hence the Central Command strikes.
So we have this intense, high-stakes global chess game happening. But who is actually moving the pieces?
Yeah, is the question.
And that brings us to one of the most sobering and frankly jarring sections of this deep dive. The broadcast takes a hard left turn away from geopolitical strategy and dives straight into mortality, examining the extreme physical fragility of the old guard in Washington.
This section centers heavily on the sudden, shocking death of 71-year-old Senator Lindsey Graham.
The broadcast notes he died of an aortic dissection.
Which is terrifying.
It is. And for those who aren't medical experts, an aortic dissection is a catastrophic medical event. It's a tear in the inner layer of the large blood vessel branching off the heart.
Right.
Blood surges through the tear, causing the inner and middle layers of the aorta to separate. It is often fatal, if not treated literally within minutes. And Graham suffered this shortly after returning from a grueling diplomatic trip to Ukraine, where he was working on a complex Russian sanctions package.
The commentator was clearly shaken by the suddenness of this.
You could hear it in their voice.
They pointed out that Graham had literally just spoken to Donald Trump on the phone the evening he died, aggressively discussing legislation, just full of energy, and then, without warning, he's just gone.
The broadcast takes a deliberate moment to eulogize his political legacy, and they focus on some very specific metrics. 23 years serving in the Senate, 33 years serving in the Air Force.
A lifetime of service.
Literally. And they highlighted a fascinating financial detail. Despite being at the absolute center of the American political machine for decades, his net worth was a relatively modest $1.4 million.
That financial detail is wielded very intentionally by the broadcast.
I thought so too.
The commentator is contrasting Graham with a trend of modern politicians who enter office with modest means and somehow, amass tens of millions of dollars over their tenure.
Right, the classic Washington enrichment story.
Exactly. By highlighting his $1.4 million net worth, the broadcast paints Graham as an authentic, uncorrupted public servant. He's framed as someone who understood the bare-knuckle game of politics, fought aggressively, but ultimately respected the institution more than his own wallet.
The broadcast specifically highlights Graham's defining moment, at least according to the clip they played of Donald Trump memorializing him. It was his fiery defense of Brett Kavanaugh during the 2018 Supreme Court confirmation hearings.
Oh, man. Those hearings.
For context, those hearings were an absolute cultural flashpoint, filled with intense allegations and furious partisan divides.
Very intense.
The broadcast plays that famous clip where Graham is just radiating righteous indignation, looking directly at the Democratic committee members and shouting, "Boy, y'all want power. God, I hope you never get it."
The commentator uses that quote as almost a prophetic warning that echoes through the rest of their analysis.
It really does.
It's framed as the ultimate distillation of what Graham was fighting against.
But the commentary also spends significant time contrasting Graham's legacy of statesmanship with the sheer toxicity of the reaction to his death online.
The internet reaction was dark.
It was. They read tweets from left-wing media figures like Cenk Uygur and Anna Kasparian, who openly celebrated his passing, mocking him as an evil mastermind's henchman, and literally saying, "Good riddance."
Wow.
They also quote a Texas imam who publicly prayed that Graham would live in eternity in ruins.
The commentator uses this vitriol to make a broader, deeply pessimistic point about the loss of shared humanity in our civic life.
Yeah.
The argument being laid out is that when politics becomes your entire religion, your entire worldview, you lose the psychological ability to see your political opponent as a human being.
They just become an obstacle.
Exactly. To these critics, Graham wasn't a person with a family. He was simply a structural obstacle to their own political power.
When the death of a rival is treated as a victory rather than a human tragedy, the broadcast suggests the viability of a shared national project is basically dead. But they don't just stay in the realm of philosophy here. This is where the broadcast dips its toe into some very dark geopolitical speculation.
Right, the conspiracy theories. The commentator notes that Graham was pushing incredibly hard for harsh Russian sanctions, that he had just returned from a war zone in Ukraine, and that his face had recently been featured on a literal Target poster at a state-sponsored Iranian funeral.
A lot of enemies.
A lot of them. The broadcast brings up the fact that poisoning is a known, documented tactic of adversarial regimes like Russia, and specifically notes that the public must wait for the final toxicology reports before accepting the natural causes narrative.
And then, almost seamlessly, the broadcast juxtaposes Graham's sudden dramatic death with the agonizingly slow decline of 84-year-old Senator Mitch McConnell.
Another Washington Titan.
McConnell had been completely missing from the public eye for weeks. He suffered a fall, was hospitalized with a severe case of pneumonia, and was subsequently moved to a rehabilitation facility. The broadcast reads a lengthy, highly polished press statement allegedly from McConnell, assuring the public he is still actively working on Senate business from his facility.
But the commentator flat out refuses to believe that statement is real.
They call it out immediately.
They point out the sheer physical impossibility of an 84-year-old man who already deals with long-term mobility issues from childhood polio, battling pneumonia, and a recent hospitalizing fall, actively managing the complex legislative affairs of a superpower from a rehab bed.
It's a stretch, for sure.
And they throw in this incredibly pointed, speculative detail. While McConnell was incapacitated in the hospital, his wife, Elaine Chao, the former transportation secretary, flew to China to meet with the Chinese vice president.
Oh, boy.
The broadcast quotes a congressman suggesting this timing is highly suspicious.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and we need to stop and debate this for a second.
Yeah.
Because the leaps in logic here are massive. I have to push back hard on the conspiracies this broadcast is weaving.
Go for it.
We are talking about a 71-year-old man who just took a grueling international flight to a high-stress war zone, suffering an aortic dissection, which is a known cardiovascular event.
A very natural, albeit tragic, medical emergency.
Exactly. And we have an 84-year-old man with a history of falls taking another fall. By validating this conspiracy framework, suggesting Russian poison and secret Chinese handover meetings, doesn't the commentator risk completely losing their credibility with any mainstream listener?
You'd think so, yes.
Aren't we just seeing the very normal, albeit deeply tragic, realities of aging men working in incredibly high-stress, sleep-deprived jobs being spun into geopolitical thrillers?
Objectively, yes. The medical explanations are infinitely more probable. But this raises an important question. You have to look at the psychological appeal of conspiracy for this specific audience.
What's the appeal?
When you feel like the world is chaotic, when you feel like traditional boundaries are collapsing all around you, a conspiracy is strangely comforting.
Comforting? Really?
Yeah, because it suggests that someone, somewhere, is in control, even if they're evil. The alternative, that the most powerful men in the world can just randomly drop dead from a torn blood vessel or fade away from a simple fall, That is terrifying.
Because it highlights the sheer randomness of mortality.
Exactly. Acknowledging mere biological frailty isn't politically galvanizing, but suggesting foreign interference or domestic cover-ups, that mobilizes an audience.
It turns biology into a thriller.
Exactly. But regardless of the conspiracy, the underlying narrative being pushed here is about vulnerability and the vacuum of power. The broadcast is painting a picture of an American political machine that is dangerously old, physically failing, and entirely lacking in succession planning.
Which brings up the actual mechanics of what happens when a senator dies or is incapacitated.
It's messy.
It's not a uniform process at all. In some states, the governor just appoints a replacement until the next election. In others, a special election has to be held. When titans like Graham and McConnell leave the board, even temporarily, it forces a high-stakes battle over the rules of the political game itself.
Because a single empty seat in a closely divided Senate can completely halt or accelerate a national agenda.
Absolutely. Who fills the void? And more importantly, who gets to decide the future direction of the country?
Which acts as a perfect thematic bridge to the next major pillar in the broadcast: immigration, demographic shifts, and the absolute flashpoint of border policy.
Right. With the old guard literally dying off, the battle over who actually gets to vote and who gets to stay in the country is reaching a boiling point.
Boiling over, really?
The broadcast brings up a highly specific, deeply disturbing legal case out of Minnesota to illustrate this clash between local leniency and federal enforcement.
Yeah, the commentator details a situation involving Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. Walz and his state parole board pardoned a Laotian man named Vang, who had a prior conviction for repeatedly sexually assaulting a 10-year-old girl.
Just horrific.
The rationale provided by the state board was that the victim had written a letter forgiving him, and Governor Walz argued that deporting Vang to a country he hadn't seen since childhood wouldn't make Minnesota any safer.
But the federal government fundamentally disagreed with that state-level assessment. The Department of Homeland Security and IC stepped in, arrested the man despite the state pardon, and deported him anyway.
Let's explain the legal mechanism here, because it is a perfect example of the supremacy clause and dual sovereignty in the U.S. Constitution.
Let's hear it.
A state governor can only pardon state crimes. They have absolute zero authority over federal immigration law.
Right.
So while Walz could forgive the criminal sentence in Minnesota, he could not erase the fact that Vang's conviction triggered mandatory deportation under federal statutes. Federal law supersedes state preference here.
The broadcast commentator uses this specific case as a visceral example of what they term suicidal empathy on the political left.
Suicidal empathy, wow.
They argue that prioritizing the comfort of a convicted child predator over the safety of American citizens is an ideology that has completely lost its mind.
The commentator is utilizing a singular, extreme legal edge case as a heavy ideological battering ram.
Definitely.
By highlighting the most egregious possible example of state-level leniency, a pardon for a crime against a child, the broadcast is able to rhetorically indict the entire broader concept of sanctuary politics.
And this conflict spills right over into the broader media narrative. The broadcast plays a clip of commentator Anna Navarro reading a list of people who were allegedly killed by ICE's agents, trying to frame federal immigration enforcement as a violent rogue entity.
Right.
But then, the commentator in our broadcast counters with their own devastating list. They read off the names of young American women, Laken Riley, Jocelyn Nungaray, Rachel Morin, and others, who were murdered by illegal immigrants.
It is a profound, incredibly grim media debate. It's basically a duel of tragedies.
Yeah.
Both sides are actively utilizing the names of the dead to validate their completely opposed policy prescriptions. The commentator uses their list to justify strict border closures and mass deportations, framing the presence of illegal immigrants as an active, lethal threat to American citizens.
But looking at the structure of this argument, I really have to question the efficacy of this list versus list rhetoric in media.
How so?
It's like watching two doctors argue over patients' diagnosis by exclusively shouting out the absolute rarest, most fatal side effects of a medication,
Right.
while completely ignoring the broader health of the patient or the actual statistical reality.
Here's a great way to put it.
Right. When media commentators reduce complex national policy to simply exchanging names of murder victims, do we actually get any closer to a legislative solution, or are we just maximizing outrage?
From an analytical standpoint, it maximizes outrage because outrage is what mobilizes voters. Nuanced discussions of immigration quotas and court backlogs, they just don't get people to the polls. Fear and anger do. And this existential fear over immigration and changing demographics is the direct driving force behind a piece of legislation the broadcast heavily champions next.
The Save America Act.
Yes.
The commentary notes that Senator Lindsey Graham was literally on the phone pushing for this exact bill the night he died. The Save America Act, championed by Senator Mike Lee, is aimed at requiring strict proof of citizenship for voter registration.
Right.
But the tactical element the broadcast highlights is the key. They're trying to push it through via a simple majority, bypassing the usual 60-vote filibuster threshold.
We need to explain the mechanics of this because it is a massive procedural escalation.
Let's dive into it.
The Senate has a rule called the filibuster, which basically requires 60 out of 100 votes to end debate and actually vote on a bill. It was designed to force consensus and protect the minority party.
It slows things down on purpose.
Exactly. However, there is a parliamentary maneuver called the nuclear option. This is where the majority party changes the Senate rules to allow a bill to pass with a simple majority, just 51 votes.
And historically, we've seen this nuclear option used for confirming judges, including Supreme Court justices, which fundamentally reshaped the courts.
It completely changed the judiciary.
But using it for sweeping federal election law. For you listening, this isn't just Washington insider baseball. Bypassing a filibuster for election law means the fundamental rules of how your local polling place operates, what ID you need to bring, all of that could drastically swing back and forth every 2 years depending on who holds a razor-thin 51% majority.
It removes all stability from the electoral process.
It really does. The broadcast argues that this extreme measure is justified because time is running out. The commentator warns that if the opposing party gains power, they will fundamentally alter the demographic and legal landscape of the country to ensure permanent, unassailable control.
The broadcast lists out these existential fears, packing the Supreme Court with additional liberal justices, granting statehood to Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico to instantly gain 4 permanent Democratic Senate seats,
Right.
and opening the borders to flood the country with new, presumably sympathetic voters.
So the Save America Act is framed not just as a standard election security bill, but as the last possible bulwark against a permanent ideological takeover.
It's all about who controls the future demographics of the country. And that naturally leads the broadcast to look ahead to the next big battleground, the 2028 presidential election.
Yep. The commentator plays a clip from the daytime talk show The View, where the hosts were mapping out their ideal Democratic candidate list.
The list included familiar names: Vice President Kamala Harris, California Governor Gavin Newsom, Senators Jon Ossoff and Josh Shapiro, Governors J.B. Pritzker and Wes Moore, and Pete Buttigieg.
A regular who's who.
Exactly. The commentator openly mocks this list, characterizing it as a heavily scripted, out-of-touch selection of candidates who range from uninspiring corporate moderates to ideologically dangerous radicals.
The broadcast reserves a very specific, incredibly sharp critique for Gavin Newsom.
Oh, they go after him hard.
They do. They play a clip of Newsom describing his political philosophy as someone who believes in addition, not division, and wanting a big tent political party that welcomes everyone.
The commentator absolutely torches this philosophy.
They really do.
They argue that a tent is only as strong as the poles holding it up. If you invite everyone into the tent without any shared baseline values or principles, including, in the commentator's view, radical elements they describe as inmates running the asylum, the tent doesn't get stronger.
It just collapses under its own contradictory weight.
This is a fundamental critique of the limits of pluralism. The broadcast is arguing that a political party, or a nation for that matter, cannot simply be an umbrella for every disparate grievance group.
Without a unifying core philosophy, addition becomes dilution, and eventually total destruction.
And the prime example the broadcast uses for this destruction is Newsom's own state, California.
The broadcast plays an audio clip of Elon Musk from October 2024. Musk warns that if the current national political trajectory continues, the whole of America will be Californicated.
Californicated.
Yeah, and Musk makes a really chilling point about geographic safety valves. He says the only reason California hasn't completely collapsed under the weight of its own policies is because unhappy citizens still have an escape valve.
They can just leave.
Right. They can pack a U-Haul, move out of California, and still be in America. But if the entire country adopts California's model at the federal level, where do you go?
This introduces a fascinating concept known as political geography and the sorting of the American populace. California has become the ultimate ideological boogeyman in conservative commentary.
It really is the prime target.
It represents the extreme endpoint of progressive governance. High taxes, heavy environmental regulation, progressive social policies, and what critics view as rampant municipal decay and crime.
And the broadcast highlights Musk physically moving his massive companies out of California as the ultimate, undeniable proof of this failure. I think we need a metaphor to really explain the mechanism of what they are fearing here. Think of federalism like the watertight bulkheads on a massive submarine.
Okay, I like this.
If one compartment or one state's policies starts flooding, you seal the heavy steel door, that compartment might be ruined, but the rest of the ship survives and stays afloat. That is the safety valve.
Right.
The fear being presented by this commentator regarding Californication is that nationalizing these policies essentially opens all the bulkhead doors at once. So if the hull breaches in California, the water rushes through the entire vessel and the whole submarine sinks.
That is an excellent way to visualize it. We used to view states as laboratories of democracy.
Right, Justice Brandeis.
The idea, championed by Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, was that different states could try different innovative policies on a small scale. If a policy worked, other states would adopt it. If it failed, the damage was contained to that single state.
So what does this all mean for the everyday citizen listening right now? The broadcast is heavily promoting the idea of voting with your feet. If you don't like the policies in your state, you pack up your family and move to a state that aligns with your values.
They're encouraging the migration.
Yes. The commentator even brags that the production staff in their studio are all refugees who fled California for a red state.
But if we extrapolate this trend of geographic sorting, it raises a profound concern about a unified national identity.
A huge concern.
The economic and social mechanisms of this sorting are powerful. As conservatives move to red states and progressives move to blue states, local laws become even more extreme because there is no political opposition left to moderate them.
We stop being a single nation with colorful regional differences, and we become two distinct, highly hostile nations that just happen to share a continent and a currency. It's the ultimate collapse of that shared national project we talked about earlier. Wow. Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today.
So much ground.
Let's synthesize this journey we've just been on through this specific broadcast.
We began at the micro level, looking at a local municipal map in New York City that omitted historical immigrant neighborhoods and a city mayor allegedly dabbling in unauthorized shadow foreign diplomacy with Iran.
Highlighting the erosion of the boundary between local zoning and global conflict.
From there, we zoomed out to the macro level, watching the federal government attempt to strike back against Iranian proxy militias abroad, while simultaneously turning that same intelligence apparatus inward to designate domestic protest groups like Antifa as terror threats at home.
We explored the volatile nature of negotiating with apocalyptic regimes where historical diplomatic norms fail and peace deals can vanish in 2 hours.
We then witnessed the fragile biological element of this political machinery. We contrasted the sudden, tragic death of a robust 71-year-old Senator Lindsey Graham with the slow, highly scrutinized decline of an 84-year-old Senator Mitch McConnell.
We analyzed how partisan media uses the rhetoric of eulogy to weaponize mortality, and why audiences find political conspiracies more comforting than the random chaos of biological failing.
We looked at the mechanisms of constitutional law, analyzing how extreme edge cases in the legal system, like a state governor's pardon of a violent offender in Minnesota, violently collide with federal immigration enforcement under the Supremacy Clause.
And we examined the list versus list rhetoric that turns tragic murders into ammunition for polarized media debates.
And finally, we ended on the battle for the demographic future, looking toward the 2028 elections. We examined the critique of pluralism via the Big Tent philosophy, the procedural nuclear option of bypassing the filibuster for election laws, and the growing trend of citizens geographically sorting themselves to escape policies they view as destructive, threatening the very concept of federalism.
It is a massive amount to digest, and we want to acknowledge you, the listener. Sitting with this much intense, hyperpolarized existential information can feel incredibly heavy.
It's designed to feel heavy.
It is meticulously designed by commentators to feel heavy. But understanding how these arguments are engineered, understanding the rhetorical architecture that allows a commentator to seamlessly connect a local zoning map to a global proxy war is absolutely vital.
It is the only way to be a resilient, well-informed consumer of media in this era.
Because in the worldview presented by this broadcast, none of these events are isolated coincidences. Every single point we discussed today is framed as an interconnected battle in a much larger winner-take-all war for the fundamental identity of the country.
Exactly. Everything is connected in this narrative.
Which leaves us with one final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. We started this deep dive looking at a local mayor's office seemingly entangled in Middle Eastern proxy wars and international diplomacy. If our politics has become so deeply nationalized, so intensely globalized and polarized, that a local city council or municipal mayor feels compelled to fight existential foreign policy battles, have we fundamentally lost the ability to govern locally?
When every single issue, from school boards to city maps, is elevated to the level of a global apocalyptic crisis, who is actually making sure the potholes are filled and the trash gets picked up?
It is a question of focus and function. If the local becomes entirely consumed by the global ceases to function at all.
Something to think about next time you look at a city map or vote for a city council member.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration. We'll be back next time with another deep dive. Keep learning, keep questioning, and take care of yourselves out there.